Los Angeles has always resisted simple criminal mythology. Unlike New York or Chicago, where organized crime hardened into compact hierarchies tied to dense immigrant neighborhoods, Los Angeles spread outward, fractured by freeways, racial lines, and endless sprawl. In this city, crime did not consolidate easily. It scattered, and for decades, two criminal worlds existed side by side, largely indifferent to one another. On one side stood the traditional Italian-American Los Angeles crime family, a La Cosa Nostra outfit modeled loosely on East Coast syndicates. On the other stood a growing constellation of Latino street gangs, rooted not in secret rooms or union halls, but in neighborhoods shaped by poverty, displacement, and street-level survival. For much of the 20th century, these two forces occupied the same city but rarely collided, operating in parallel rather than in competition. The Italian-American crime family in Los Angeles never achieved the mythic power of its New York counterparts. There was no equivalent to the five families, no sprawling underworld fed by millions of newly arrived immigrants who shared language, bloodlines, and loyalty. Southern California's Italian-American population was smaller, more dispersed, and quicker to assimilate into legitimate society. This limited the mob's ability to replenish its ranks or exert deep cultural control over entire neighborhoods. Instead, the LA crime family focused on quieter, less visible rackets, bookmaking, gambling rooms hidden behind storefronts, labor racketeering, distribution, and later white-collar schemes that attracted less attention than street violence. Their power depended on discretion. They avoided unnecessary bloodshed, not out of morality, but because homicide invited scrutiny that could dismantle fragile operations. At the same time, Latino street gangs were multiplying across Southern California. Their origins had little to do with organized crime in the traditional sense. These gangs emerged from barrios fractured by segregation, policing, and economic exclusion. They were hyperlocal, defined by streets, housing projects, and shared identity rather than profit margins. Violence was personal and territorial. Slayings erupted over insults, borders, and perceived disrespect, not structured rackets or long-term strategy. These gangs lacked centralized leadership and rarely thought beyond their immediate surroundings. To the Italian mob, they were noise, not competition. And to the gangs, the Italian mob might as well have been invisible, an old-world rumor with no relevance to their daily reality. This separation was not accidental. The Italian crime family understood that Los Angeles was not a city that rewarded overt domination. Law enforcement agencies were aggressive, media scrutiny was intense, and federal investigations loomed constantly. The mob's survival depended on staying beneath the surface. Street gangs, by contrast, lived in full view of the city, their conflicts spilling into alleyways, parks, and schoolyards. These two approaches to crime were fundamentally incompatible. The mob saw no value in attempting to control volatile street gangs that invited chaos and law enforcement attention. The gangs, meanwhile, had no access to the mob's rackets and no leverage to challenge them. As a result, direct conflict between Italian mobsters and Latino gangs was exceedingly rare. But beneath this apparent stability, structural weaknesses were already forming. The Italian mob's model relied on continuity, fathers mentoring sons, uncles vouching for nephews, generations sustaining the code. In Los Angeles, that continuity eroded quickly. Younger Italian Americans pursued legitimate careers and suburban lives, leaving fewer recruits willing to risk prison for dwindling rewards. Meanwhile, federal prosecutions in the post-war era increasingly targeted organized crime, using conspiracy statutes and informants to decapitate leadership. Each indictment thinned the ranks further. The LA crime family survived, but it did not grow. It aged. In contrast, the Latino street gang ecosystem was expanding relentlessly. Immigration, demographic shifts, and aggressive policing funneled young men into county jails and state prisons at unprecedented rates. While the streets remained chaotic, something transformative was happening behind bars. Incarceration forced rival gang members into shared spaces, creating pressure for new forms of organization. Survival in prison required alliances, discipline, and collective identity on a scale far beyond the neighborhood. What began as protection would soon evolve into governance. But at this early stage, the Italian mob remained largely unaware of what was forming inside California's prison system. The absence of conflict between these worlds created a dangerous illusion that the Italian mob would always be Los Angeles's most organized criminal force, and that street gangs would remain fragmented, self-destructive, and strategically irrelevant. Law enforcement largely shared this view. Investigators focused on mob figures when discussing organized crime, while gangs were treated as a social problem rather than a syndicate in waiting. This miscalculation would prove costly. The real shift in power was not happening on the streets or in gambling rooms, but in cell blocks and prison yards, where a new kind of criminal authority was being forged. By the late 1960s and 1970s, the city's criminal balance was quietly tilting. The Italian mob still existed, but its influence was static, its methods outdated in a city increasingly defined by drugs rather than dice games. Latino gangs were still disorganized on the streets, but their members were learning discipline behind bars, absorbing rules enforced not by tradition, but by terror. The seeds of a prison-based empire were being planted, one that would eventually render the old mafia irrelevant to the daily mechanics of crime in Southern California. The two worlds had coexisted without war, but history was moving toward consolidation, not coexistence. And when that consolidation came, it would not be subtle, restrained, or negotiated. It would be enforced through slaughter, obedience, and homicide on a scale Los Angeles had never seen. By the time Los Angeles entered the late 1960s, the true transformation of its criminal underworld was no longer happening on the streets. It was happening behind concrete walls, topped with razor wire, in cell blocks where time stretched endlessly and survival depended on allegiance. California's prison system, swollen by mass arrests and long sentences, had become a crucible. Men who once represented dozens of rival neighborhoods were now confined together, stripped of geography but not identity. Inside those yards, chaos could not last. Disorder invited slaughter. And from that pressure emerged something entirely new, a prison-based authority that would outgrow every traditional criminal organization in Southern California. The Mexican Mafia, known simply as La M, was not born as a drug cartel or a street empire. It began as a survival mechanism. In the late 1950s, Mexican-American inmates faced constant threat from more established prison groups. Protection required unity, and unity required rules. What started as mutual defense quickly hardened into hierarchy. Membership became exclusive. Loyalty became absolute. Disobedience became a death sentence. Unlike street gangs, where leadership shifted and violence was impulsive, La M was methodical. It understood that power inside prison depended on discipline, secrecy, and the willingness to order slaughter without hesitation. Prison, paradoxically, gave La M what the Italian mob in Los Angeles never truly possessed: a renewable population, and a centralized command structure. Every year, thousands of young Latino gang members flowed into county jails and state prisons. Incarceration did not weaken the street gangs, it fed the system. Inside, these inmates were sorted, pressured, and indoctrinated. Southern California gang members were labeled sureños and placed under the authority of la M, whether they wanted it or not. Compliance meant protection. Resistance meant isolation, assault, or a slow walk toward homicide. Prison was not a break from gang life, it was its final form. While the Italian mob relied on aging figures who avoided incarceration at all costs, the Mexican Mafia thrived inside it. Leaders serving life sentences were not removed from power, they were elevated. Prison became a boardroom. Orders flowed outward through coded letters, visitors, and intermediaries. A man locked in a cell could still decide who lived and who would be slaughtered on the streets of Los Angeles. This inversion of power shocked law enforcement. The idea that inmates controlled neighborhoods from behind bars upended traditional crime-fighting logic, but by the time authorities grasped it, the structure was already entrenched. The Italian-American crime family watched this shift with limited understanding and even less ability to respond. Their influence had always depended on remaining invisible, operating in social clubs and backrooms. They had no mechanism to command street-level soldiers en masse, and no leverage inside prisons where the real authority was forming. Drugs had also changed the equation. The mob's reluctance to immerse itself deeply in narcotics left a vacuum. Methamphetamine, heroin, and later fentanyl flooded Southern California, and distribution required armies, not accountants. Latino gangs provided manpower. La M provided coordination. The Italian mob had neither. Inside the prison system, La M enforced a code that blurred the line between business and terror. Orders were not debated. If a street gang failed to pay tribute, the response was not negotiation. It was a directive to slay. If a member disrespected leadership, the punishment could arrive years later, patiently executed the moment opportunity presented itself. Violence was not reactive, it was instructional. Every homicide sent a message that obedience was not optional. This created a culture where fear replaced loyalty, and fear proved far more reliable. By the 1970s and 1980s, the Mexican Mafia's influence extended far beyond prison yards. Street gangs that once fought independently now found themselves bound to a larger machine. Drug dealers paid taxes not to local bosses, but to unseen figures serving life sentences. Neighborhood beefs were overridden by prison politics. A conflict sparked in a cell block could ignite a chain of slayings across multiple cities. This was not chaos. It was centralized violence, deployed strategically to maintain control. Law enforcement efforts struggled to adapt. Arresting gang members no longer disrupted operations, it strengthened them. Each incarceration reinforced La M's authority and expanded its reach. The prison system itself became an unwilling partner in criminal consolidation. Meanwhile, the Italian mob continued to shrink, its remaining members aging out or retreating into obscurity. There were no headline wars, no dramatic confrontations between old-world mobsters and new-world gang leaders. The power transfer happened quietly, bureaucratically, enforced through paperwork, visitation logs, and carefully planned homicides carried out by disposable soldiers. By the end of this period, Los Angeles no longer had competing criminal empires. It had a dominant structure rooted in incarceration and enforced through terror. The Italian Mafia still existed in name, but it no longer mattered in the daily mechanics of street crime. The real authority now spoke Spanish, operated through prison yards, and viewed violence not as excess, but as policy. The city had not descended into lawlessness. It had evolved into something colder and more efficient. And with that efficiency came an inevitable consequence: rebellion. That rebellion would not come from outsiders or rival ethnic groups. It would come from within the Latino gang world itself, as some gangs began to question whether obedience under threat of slaughter was survival or a slow-motion death sentence. Those internal fractures would ignite the bloodiest chapter yet. By the time the Mexican Mafia's authority became undeniable, its greatest threat no longer came from law enforcement or rival ethnic groups. It came from inside its own dominion. Absolute control breeds resentment as efficiently as it breeds obedience, and within the vast network of Sureño street gangs, cracks were beginning to form. La M ruled through fear, but fear does not erase memory. It only delays retaliation. As taxes increased, orders multiplied, and street-level soldiers realized they were expendable, whispers of resistance began to circulate, quietly at first, then violently. At the heart of La M's power was its tribute system. Every gang operating under its banner was expected to pay for the privilege of survival. Drug sales were taxed. Prison protection came at a cost. Failure to comply invited swift and unforgiving consequences. A gang that withheld money or questioned authority could be placed on the list, a bureaucratic death sentence that followed its members wherever they went. The order to slay could be delivered months or even years after the original offense, ensuring that fear lingered constantly. Violence was not emotional or spontaneous. It was scheduled, sanctioned, and enforced. For many street gang members, this reality marked a turning point. The mythology of brotherhood collided with the reality of exploitation. Young men joined gangs believing they were defending neighborhoods and identity, only to discover they were feeding a prison-based machine that viewed them as disposable labor. They risked homicide from rivals, law enforcement, and even their own allies, all while funneling profits upward to men serving life sentences. Some accepted this as the cost of survival. Others did not. The most significant challenge to La M's authority emerged in East Los Angeles during the late 1980s and 1990s, among a cluster of gangs known collectively as the Maravilla gangs. Unlike many Sureño sets, Maravilla gangs had deep historical roots and strong local cohesion. They viewed themselves not as subsidiaries of a prison syndicate, but as independent entities with their own legacy. When demands from La M intensified, more money, stricter obedience, more bodies, they resisted. That resistance was not symbolic, it was open defiance. La M responded the only way it knew how, through terror. Members of Maravilla-affiliated gangs were targeted inside prisons and on the streets. Orders to slay were issued with surgical precision. Informants were hunted. Suspected sympathizers were assaulted or slaughtered as warnings. What followed was not a clean war, but a brutal internal purge that left entire neighborhoods soaked in blood. This was not a battle for territory against outsiders. It was civil war within the Latino gang structure, driven by the question of who truly owned the streets, the men living there or the men locked behind bars. Prison yards became execution grounds. Inmates affiliated with rebellious gangs were ambushed during recreation, stabbed in showers, or strangled in cells. Outside, younger members were pressured to prove loyalty by carrying out homicides ordered from inside. The violence fed itself, each slaying justified the next. Entire families were displaced as neighborhoods became battlegrounds for obedience. Law enforcement, watching the carnage, struggled to explain it publicly. To outsiders, it looked like senseless gang violence. In reality, it was enforcement. Corporate discipline executed with knives and bullets, At the same time, La M was fighting on multiple fronts. Its historic rivalry with the Nuestra Familia, the Northern California prison gang, continued to generate bloodshed across the state. The North versus South divide ensured that inmates arriving from different regions were instantly placed on opposing sides, regardless of personal history. Alliances shifted constantly, but the rules never softened. Neutrality was impossible. A man either aligned or became a target. Homicide was the language through which these alliances were negotiated. The Black guerrilla family added another layer of complexity. While not a Latino organization, its presence inside California prisons forced strategic decisions. Temporary alliances formed, fractured, and reformed based on convenience rather than ideology. These relationships further reinforced the idea that prison politics, not street realities, dictated life and death. A teenager on the streets of Los Angeles could be slaughtered because of a decision made hundreds of miles away by men he had never met. The internal wars revealed the true nature of La Aim's power. It was not charismatic. It was not popular. It was bureaucratic and absolute. Leadership did not rely on inspiration, but on inevitability. Resistance was crushed not because it was morally wrong, but because it threatened the system's efficiency. Over time, most rebellions failed. The Maravilla gangs were weakened, fragmented, or forced into submission. Survivors learned the lesson La M intended to teach. Independence was fatal. Yet the cost of this control was immense. Violence escalated to levels that destabilized entire communities. Innocent people were caught in the crossfire of enforcement actions meant to send messages. Children grew up surrounded by memorials and candlelit sidewalks, marking where someone had been slaughtered for failing to comply with an invisible hierarchy. The streets no longer belonged to those who lived on them. They belonged to the prison. By the late 1990s, the outcome was clear. La M had survived rebellion, absorbed dissent, and reaffirmed its dominance. The Italian mob, long since irrelevant, barely registered in this landscape. Organized crime in Los Angeles was no longer about ethnicity or old-world traditions. It was about control through incarceration, obedience through fear, and violence as a management tool. The system had proven resilient, adaptable, and brutally effective, but a new force was already reshaping the equation. One that would push this prison-based empire beyond local rackets and into the global drug economy. As methamphetamine and later fentanyl flooded Southern California, alliances with international cartels would redefine power yet again. The violence that followed would not just enforce order. It would fuel an industry measured not in neighborhoods, but in billions of dollars and body counts. By the early 2000s, the transformation of Los Angeles' criminal ecosystem was complete. What had begun decades earlier as parallel worlds, an aging Italian mob operating quietly and a chaotic sprawl of street gangs, had evolved into a single, dominant structure rooted in prison authority and fueled by global narcotics. The Mexican Mafia no longer merely controlled gangs. It controlled access to drugs, to territory, to survival itself. The streets were no longer the center of gravity. They were the battlefield where decisions made behind bars were enforced through slaughter and homicide with ruthless efficiency. The drug economy reshaped everything. Cocaine had once dominated, but methamphetamine surged, cheap to produce and devastatingly addictive. Later came fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so potent that a few grains could end a life. These substances demanded distribution networks capable of moving volume, enforcing discipline, and silencing disruption instantly. This was not an environment suited to the remnants of the Italian-American crime family. Their cautious, low-profile methods could not compete with a system willing to sacrifice hundreds of street-level soldiers to protect supply lines. They faded into near total irrelevance, their legacy reduced to footnotes and nostalgia. For Laem, cartel partnerships were not a departure from its model, but an expansion of it. Mexican drug trafficking organizations needed control over American street distribution. The Mexican Mafia already possessed that control. Sureño gangs functioned as retail outlets, muscle, and enforcement arms. Cartels supplied product. La M ensured obedience. It was a symbiotic relationship built on terror. If a dealer skimmed profits or aligned with the wrong supplier, the response was swift. Orders flowed outward, and somewhere on a sidewalk, in a car, or behind a convenience store, someone would be slayed to restore balance. What made this system so resilient was its detachment from individual leaders. In traditional organized crime, removing a boss could destabilize an entire network. In La M's structure, leadership was collective and replaceable. Men serving life sentences continued to issue commands, and when one was isolated or transferred, another stepped in. Violence filled any gaps. The system did not require innovation or charisma. It required compliance. Fear ensured the rest. Law enforcement adapted but struggled. Massive indictments and racketeering cases exposed parts of the structure, yet the machine continued to function. Arrests removed actors, not authority. In some cases, prosecutions even strengthened La M's myth, reinforcing the idea that prison was not an end, but a promotion. Younger gang members internalized the lesson. Incarceration did not sever power, it centralized it. The prison system remained the nerve center of Southern California's underworld. Communities paid the price. Neighborhoods lived under invisible rule where disputes were settled not by local elders or even gang leaders, but by distant figures serving decades behind bars. A teenager could be ordered to commit homicide to earn stripes, proving loyalty to a hierarchy he barely understood. Refusal was not an option. Disobedience invited slaughter, not just of the individual, but sometimes of associates, meant to serve as examples. Violence became generational, a cycle passed down like inheritance. Meanwhile, the Italian mob's absence went largely unnoticed. There was no dramatic fall, no final war. Their decline was quiet, almost polite. They had been outpaced, outnumbered, and outadapted. Organized crime in Los Angeles had changed language, culture, and strategy. The word mafia no longer conjured images of tailored suits and social clubs. It meant prison yards, coded messages, and an omnipresent threat of homicide enforced by young men who would never see middle age. Today, the consequences are embedded in the city's fabric. Mass incarceration continues to feed the system it was meant to dismantle. Every arrest strengthens prison authority. Every long sentence reinforces the idea that power lives behind walls, not on streets. The violence persists, not because the system is broken, but because it works exactly as designed. Order is maintained through terror. Profits flow upward. Bodies mark the boundaries of compliance. Los Angeles did not lose organized crime. It evolved into something colder, more efficient, and less visible. The old mafia became irrelevant not through defeat, but through obsolescence. In its place rose an empire that understands patience, permanence, and fear. An empire that does not need public recognition, only obedience. And as long as prisons remain factories of affiliation, and the drug economy remains relentless, that empire will continue to rule, quietly, invisibly, and enforced through slaughter.